Good morning and welcome to another episode of Questions for Lawyers. I'm Jeff Adelman, personal injury attorney, and I'm thrilled to have with me Andrea Jacobs of Brodsky Jacobs and Brook Law Firm. I'm used to calling it BJB Lawyers, and I know all of you, but I'm thrilled to have you here, and you're going to be talking to us about immigration law.
Yeah, I'm thrilled to be here. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Well, can you tell everybody a little bit about your background, how you got into immigration law?
This is a great story. Well, I've been practicing immigration law for almost 30 years now, and I was working at a general practice when I graduated from UF Law, and my father owned a medical staffing company, and he wanted to bring in Filipino physical therapists.
Oh, okay.
So he called me up and he said, "Is this something that you think you can do?" They did not give immigration law. It was not offered at UF at that time, back in the late 80s. And I called up the immigration office, the local office, and somebody actually answered the phone back then. And they said, the first thing you need to do is join AILA, the American Immigration Lawyers Association, excuse me, and get a mentor. And I did. And we filed the paperwork and we got 2 physical therapists, and it just took off from there. And we started hiring, my dad started hiring nurses from outside the US, and I loved it. And I moved over to his corporate law firm and opened their immigration department, and then subsequently went out on my own a few years later.
So your father was an attorney as well?
No, he owned a medical staffing company.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so we did work together for probably 25 years.
That's wonderful.
Yeah.
How many years have you been practicing?
29 years.
29 years. So
Yeah.
coming up on the big 3-0
Yes.
for legal practice.
Yes.
That's great. Well, you have been extremely busy of late in your law firm. Scott Brook just became the mayor of
Yes.
Coral Springs, one of your partners.
Yes, we're so proud of him.
I know, we all are. In addition to that, I know Nancy is very busy with family law practice.
Mm-hmm.
And you've been under the gun lately for H-1B visas. There's some deadlines coming up. Can you tell us what H-1B visas are and why you've been so busy of late concerning those?
Sure. H-1B visas are temporary non-immigrant professional visas. So the position needs to require at least a bachelor's degree or the equivalent years of experience. So, for example, we have about 26 software engineer petitions that we have downstairs that we're getting ready to go out. The visas need to be filed on April 1st every year for an October 1st start date. Right now, what happens in the H-1B world is hundreds of thousands of petitions get filed for 65,000 slots. And they receipt petitions in for the first 5 business days after April 1st. And then they run an electronic lottery and select from there. So out of the 30 some odd visas that we'll be filing, we hope that we'll get 25%.
So if I'm understanding correctly, the filing date is April 1st, and there's a quota.
Yes.
So there's only so many spots. So you got to get in as soon as the doors open.
Yeah, well, because you have to file in the first 5 days. If you file outside of that 5-day period, they'll reject your petition outright.
Okay.
So there are some exceptions to the rule. If it's an institution of higher education or another company related to an institution of higher education or some nonprofits, they're not subject to the quota.
Okay.
And they can file all year round. If somebody is already here in H-1B status and they want to change their employer, they can file year round, but it's just that initial group coming in.
Okay, well, that's a very specific area of immigration.
Mm-hmm.
But generally, I'm sure most would like to know, we always hear about, we want people to become United States citizens.
Yes.
Can you explain that process in a Reader's Digest version of
Sure.
how you can't just go in and say, yeah, I want to be a U.S. citizen. What's required to become a United States citizen?
Okay, so you have to be a lawful permanent resident before you can even apply for U.S. citizenship unless you're born in the United States. Okay, so there's some other derivative classifications, but the main gist of it is you need to be a lawful permanent resident. So in order to become a lawful permanent resident, you need a sponsor, and it can either be a family-based petitioner or it can be an employment-based petitioner. And depending on your background, your classifications, you know, this is why we have an initial consultation in the office. We go through all of your background, all of your possibilities, whether or not you have United States citizen relatives, whether you have an employer that could sponsor you. So, you know, these days the family-based quotas are very retrogressed, and believe it or not, employment-based might be the easiest way if you're not married to an American to get your green card, which is permanent residency, and we do. That's basically what we do in our practice is corporate immigration law. So companies will sponsor somebody for a labor certification, which means we test the U.S. labor market, ensure there's not a U.S. worker that could fill the position, which these days there's really not. You know, we have very high unemployment these days, and these petitions are pretty much sailing through a 1.5 to 2 years, whether you're a skilled worker or unskilled worker. You can pretty much, if you have an employer willing to go through the process with you, you can pretty much get your green card. Once you have your green card for 5 years if it's employment based, or 3 years if you're married to an American, then you can apply for your citizenship.
So it's actually easier these days to go through your employer to become a United States citizen than through like a familial relationship?
Unless you're married to an American, even or in some situations, a child sponsoring a parent.
Okay.
But that process still takes it could take over a year. Right
How long has it been like that? Has it always been where a employer relationship is easier to go through than familial or anything like that? Or is that something that's changed over the years?
All the quotas move based on usage, and throughout the past, you know, my tenure of doing this, you know, we've seen retrogression in different categories at different times. What happened when the Trump administration took office, they put in a directive that all employment-based cases that were filed in the U.S. must be interviewed. And previously, only 2% of the cases were interviewed just to make sure that everything was being done right. So now they pushed all the family-based cases back in order to interview the employment-based cases. So we don't have enough immigration officers, which is a huge problem. And so now we're seeing that the marriage cases that were taking maybe 4 to 8 months to be processed are now taking over 2 years to be processed.
You brought up the changes, excuse me, under the Trump administration. I imagine that you have seen a difference in your business in terms of the type of calls you get and what you have to do. Can you talk about how much different your practice has been since Donald Trump took office?
Yes, we've seen an unseen directive at the service center level of we call them RFEs, they're requests for evidence. We've seen a record number of RFEs since he took office. Virtually on every employment-based case, we'll see an RFE. So that in turn is costing client more money because in order to answer, sometimes these RFEs are I heard someone tell me today, they got one that was 18 pages long.
And what is RFE again? Request
for evidence. So once you do your initial filing, the service is coming back at you and saying, listen, you didn't give us this. We want you to prove this and we want you to prove that. And it's just, it's a tremendous amount of additional work. So it's costing employers more money. On the family-based side of it, we really haven't seen that much of a difference other than the timing. There's many more denials of employment-based petitions than there were previously. We represent a lot of software development companies, and these companies that have never had any issues getting people in have been getting denials for the first time. Really. So there's been some changes. I mean, monetarily on our side, we're making more money, but it's very disheartening not to be able to give your client what they're paying for. So,
and knowing what clients were paying years ago compared to now.
exactly.
And that leads me to my next question. And again, whenever somebody comes to an attorney, one of the first things they want to know is, how much is this going to cost me?
Mm-hmm.
So if you could, how is it that you charge for your services, and what could somebody expect to pay?
Okay, so most immigration attorneys historically have charged flat fee. So we have really a fee sheet, and based, if they're basic matters and they're not complex with issues like criminal records, things of that nature, then we charge on a flat fee scale. A lot of immigration attorneys have been changing that in the past 2 years, and they've been going to hourly rates because of these requests for evidence, having to file appeals, and we have kept with our flat fee rates for now. So to give you just an example, citizenship application, we charge $1,500 for. That's, of course, if there aren't any glaring issues like an arrest, like failing to file tax returns, voting when you're not a U.S. citizen, things of that nature.
Okay. What are the costs to the United States government that somebody would have to shell out in addition to attorney's fees?
So for the citizenship application, the filing fee with USCIS is $725.
Okay, so I guess on average, what would you say an immigration case would cost a person who assumingly, has a green card and is applying to be a United States citizen, assuming they don't have any criminal issues, anything like that? Ballpark, what kind of a range would you expect a person to have to pay, including attorney's fees and the costs for processing?
We charge $2,325, $2,325. I think, there's probably a range between $2,000 and $2,500 or $2,000 to $3,000. We're pretty reasonably priced in the market. $1,500, we're doing several hours worth of work with the consultation and everything included. So
now, when somebody comes to you for a consultation, I know with personal injury, it's a free consultation. How does it work for an initial consultation with an immigration attorney such as yourself or your competition for that matter?
Okay, so when an immigration call comes into the office, my case manager, who's been my case manager for almost 20 years now, we've been together, so she really knows immigration law inside out. She fields that first initial call, makes sure that we can actually help the person, sets them up for a consultation. I charge $275 for an immigration consultation, but that money is applied towards the retainer when you hire us. So if you hire us, you're not out any money. If you come and spend an hour with me, you paid me $275 for that hour.
Well, it sounds like it's a very detailed interview that you give the person to
Yes.
see if you can help them.
Yes, we do.
How does the immigration system in the United States compare to other countries like, for say Canada?
So my knowledge of the Canadian immigration system is that it's a point-based system. And the way that the points are awarded is if you have a higher education, you're granted more points. If you have extreme wealth and you have businesses, you're awarded points for that. And that's how they've stimulated the Canadian economy as far as immigration goes, because they want to get higher level thinkers and investors into the country. And I know President Trump had spoken about changing our system to mirror the Canadian system when he first took office as well.
Because the people that are getting awarded those points, assumably, would have more to offer,
right,
coming in.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, when I first started practicing, maybe like 5 years into my first law firm, my solo practice, I hired an immigration attorney on an H-1B visa, and she was from Italy. and we had discussed getting her green card in the US, and she was mirroring Canada and US at that time, and it was way easier for her to get a green card, land and immigrant status in Canada than it was for us to sponsor her in the US.
Interesting.
Yeah,
I wouldn't
because she had
think
the
that.
education. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
For us to do it, we would have had to go through the whole labor certification process and prove there wasn't a lawyer that could take her job. And at that time, it was taking quite a number of years to do it.
So in a way, Canada is taking advantage of the fact that our system puts so many hurdles in front of it that some of those skilled workers are going up north rather than joining forces with our country.
Yeah, sometimes they do.
Okay. We've talked a lot about green cards.
Mm-hmm.
Can you tell us a little bit about the process of applying for a green card and what that would cost a person?
Okay, so the family-based green cards are they're much more simple than doing an employment-based green card. So typical family-based green card application is the American or the lawful permanent resident is applying for a family member. We prepare approximately 4 to 8 different petitions depending on what their status is here and what they need for filing with immigration. If they're here in lawful status and they can stay, then they would process for their adjustment of status through the United States. We charge $3,250 for the entire process. Now that might be split up, like maybe we're filing for somebody outside the US, so it's $1,625 when that petition gets approved, and then they go for their actual visa issuance abroad. The other $1,625 gets paid, and then all the filing fees and visa fees are additional. The employment-based cases, to do a labor certification like we talked about, we charge $7,500 for the labor certification and the immigrant visa petition. The employer must pay for that. So
wow.
The employer has to be willing. Now, there's also costs that are pretty high on that, depending on where the employer's located. They have to advertise. And they have to advertise 2 Sundays in a local paper. If it's a professional position, they have to advertise in trade journals, on the internet. There's a lot of different requirements. So the advertising could run them another few $1,000s on top of that. And then the second step of the process is if the person is here legally and can adjust their status here, then that would be $1,500 per family member plus filing fees and costs. Or if they're outside the country, then they would need to consular process and get their visa fees, and also $1,500 for the attorney's fees.
So when I was asking you before about what it costs to become a United States citizen, we were just talking about the costs after somebody has a green card.
Right.
So what we're really talking about here is if somebody wants to become a United States citizen,
mm-hmm.
they can expect to drop $7,000 to $15,000, it sounds like.
Right. Well, again, the employer has to pay for the employment base.
Okay, but if an individual wants to become a United States citizen, they're looking at
probably about $7,000.
About $7,000 that they're going to have to come up with
over a 6-year period of time.
Okay.
Yeah. So, I mean, we always split up our fees too. Even when we do the labor certification, we get a quarter of the fee when we start, a quarter of the fee when we file the labor certification, mm-hmm. a quarter when it's approved, and a quarter when we file the immigrant visa petition. So we always work with our clients to spread out the costs so they don't have to come out of pocket for everything right in advance.
And if somebody is here illegally, meaning that they do not have green cards, they cross the border, and they're in the shadows, basically. Is there any incentive for somebody like that to announce themselves and try to become a United States citizen?
Right now, there's nothing in the law to help somebody who entered without inspection. As a matter of fact, all of the enforcement that, if they leave and they've been here over a year and they leave the United States, they trigger a bar. If nobody knows they've been here, that could be a different story. If they entered without inspection and they marry a U.S. citizen and the U.S. citizen applies for them, and the visa is approved, they can apply for a waiver if there's a hardship to the family to have that person go back. But they ultimately need to consular process. So they ultimately, if the waiver is approved, they need to go back to their country of origin to process the visa and come back. And most unlawful immigrants don't want to do that. They're afraid.
And how many people, do you know how many people, do we know on average how many people are in that category right now?
11 to 17 million.
11 to 17 million. Do you, based on your experience, do you have, if Congress were asking you what to do about those people, what do you think the most efficient thing to do would be? What, I mean, without getting too political, but given that we have 11 to 17 million people in the shadows, there really isn't anything that we can do to give them an incentive to come out and know that they're here. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay.
And you know, in 1986, President Reagan had amnesty, introduced the amnesty, and everybody thought that would be a fix to immigration, but they did the amnesty and then they didn't fix the immigration system. So I think you raise a really good point, and I believe that there should be some pathway to citizenship for these undocumented immigrants, and I believe there's been good legislation introduced to do that.
Right.
But unless we fix the problems, then it's always going to continue to be an issue.
Right. And at the same time, even people who are upset that people are here illegally, I mean, it's a real issue. It's not going away. And unfortunately, there just doesn't seem to be any mechanism to deal with it. Rounding up 11 to 17 million people is not going to be a real easy thing to do for any country.
Exactly. If these people aren't doing anything wrong and they're flying under the radar, nobody knows where they are or what they're doing. And yeah, that will never be achieved.
Well, Andrea, thank you so much for being with me today. This was a lot of fun. Can you please tell everybody how they can contact you if they have any questions in the future? I put your website up on the screen, but if you could tell them your phone number and your email address, whatever information you'd like to give them.
Great. Again, our law firm is Brodsky, Jacobs & Brooke. We're actually located just one floor under Jeff's office. And
I hope the commute wasn't too hard.
It was awesome today. And you could reach us at 954-344-7737. My email, Andrea, Andrea, at bjblawyers.com. And again, we would love to help anybody that has any questions.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Have an awesome day, Andrea.
You too.
That's what that